Hello my friends, I am Mini Pride from Milk and Cookies Total War, and today we're going to be delving into the long and impressive history of the Blood Knights, a disparate group of warriors the world over, who nevertheless share bonds of lineage and martial skill, and whose origins can be traced back 1200 years before the birth of Sigmar Heldenhammer. Who were they, where did they come from, and what impact did their orders have on the course of history? So one of the most important foundations of Warhammer Fantasy Lore is the creation and subsequent diaspora of vampires from the ruins of Ancient Lahmia. We discussed in our Neferata lore video the cascade effect the creation of the Elixir of Life wrought. Alongside the High Priest Sorin, who would later found the Necrarch bloodline, Neferata created a potion that granted immortality, but at a terrible price. The Red Thirst, an undying lust for blood that would basically consume the waking thoughts of all vampires, and through a powerful and trusted cabal made up of the most prominent figures in all of the Nehekaran kingdoms, a civil war erupted for control of the heart of that empire, with Neferata's vampires on one side and a very angry populace on the other. Even as powerful as those vampires were, this was a time where the blood kiss wasn't handed out left and right, and there simply weren't enough of them to contend with Alcatizar the Conqueror and his legions when he wrestled the throne back from their dark clutches. So, as Lahmia burned, the vampires fled, leading to one of the great diasporas in Warhammer history. New kingdoms would be founded across the planet, in the steaming, predatory jungles of Lustria, and along the treacherous vampire coast, where tens of thousands of doomed sailors met their untimely ends in the millennia that followed. The Strigos Empire was founded in Morcane, and would exert its influence over the Badlands for almost 1,000 years, and of course, Vasha Nesh, the infamous Vlad von Karstein, came upon a crumbling kingdom at Castle Drakenhof, where he founded the strongest of the vampire bloodlines, a bloodline that would haunt the Empire of Man until its undoing some 800 years later. But while these progenitor vampires were scattered to the four winds after the fall of Lahmia, there was one in particular who would go on to form a martial caste of immense power and influence, whose presence would be felt on countless battlefields. He's a character we've talked about before, one of the finest warriors in history, Abhorash, first of the Blood Dragons. Now, Abhorash was captain of the Queen's Guard and Neferata's lover, a very virtuous man who was basically tricked into drinking her blood, and this curse manifests itself in a couple of ways. One, it amplifies his already impressive skill with the blade. As we know, one of the side effects of the curse of vampirism is unnatural speed, strength, stamina, and combat prowess. And so, when you take a man who was already one of the finest human warriors on the planet, and then grant him superpowers essentially, you can imagine what emerges on the other side is an absolutely terrifying martial specimen. And that is exactly what Abhorash becomes. But at the same time, the Red Thirst is overwhelming, even for a dude known for his pride and honor. And in one night, he loses control and ends up slaughtering a whole bunch of innocent people. So in the wake of the fall of Lahmia, he has this burning hatred for both vampirism and humanity, and there's a whole lot of self-loathing going on. He hates humans for the betrayal of the mortal priest kings, who let this cancer of Nagash take root and gnaw at the underbelly of his beloved city, and he hates his curse because it made him do terrible things that he never would have done otherwise. So a long period of wandering happens where Abhorash takes a very select group of the finest vampire warriors from the Queen's Guard and travels throughout the Badlands and World's Edge Mountains, and he begins to form a martial code, a set of teachings that forsake magic and hunting of the weak and innocent, that focuses solely on seeking out the finest warriors and monsters, defeating them, and drinking from their essence. And this all culminates with a titanic battle between Abhorash and a dragon at the summit of a great mountain, where he senses that a challenge of this magnitude is what he's been training for his entire life. They spend an entire night trying to kill each other, until at last the captain stabs it through the heart, drinks deeply, throws down his enemy, and smotes its bloodless ruin upon the mountainside. And lo and behold, the blood of this fearsome red dragon flowing through his veins, he is cured of his thirst for humans for good. To my knowledge, the only vampire in history to cure the Red Thirst. And so, he basically disappears from history at this point, only making a handful of cameo appearances before the world ends. And it's a shame, because Josh Reynolds was going to write a novel for him for the rest of his story arc that was cancelled and never made it to publishing. But the legacy he leaves behind is a very important one, because there are three of his bloodline in particular that he gives the kiss to directly that make a huge impact on the world at large. Wallach Harkin, founder of the Order of Blood Dragons, the Red Duke, Scourge of Aquitaine, and Luther Harkin, ruler of the Vampire Coast in Lustria. So this is a crossroads for the Vampire Palace Guard. Do they follow Abhorash's legacy to the letter, or do they forge a new path of their own? Well, What ends up happening is that each of these characters will end up inheriting some elements of what made their progenitor great, but bend and warp the rest of his code to suit their needs, or otherwise ignore his noblest qualities completely. And it's important for me to note that vampires are as different between each other as you and me. Just because Abhorash was a stand-up dude by the standards of the Warhammer world doesn't mean his followers will turn out the same way. I frequently see people ask stuff like, aren't vampires evil? Aren't they incredibly powerful? Aren't they better fighters than other races? And as with anything, the answer to those questions is more nuanced than a simple yes or no. The simple answer is, it depends on the vampire. Wallach Harkin is a great example of that. He takes the structure and ideals laid out in Abhorash's martial code and turns them into reality, but with a malignant twist at the end that ends up causing a lot more pain and suffering than anything the Dragon Slayer himself would have ever made. He's an interesting character because there's a part of him that's virtuous and honorable, and another part that's absolutely brutal and cruel that surfaces whenever the hunger overtakes him. And this warping of noble qualities, this skewed stance that so many Blood Knights take on the world at large, that can only really be understood by someone who is functionally immortal, is a big part of what makes Blood Knights what they are. To be clear, they aren't all the same. They have their own personalities, they have their own motivations, but it is a defining characteristic for many of them, this warped worldview and general malevolence, because unlike Abhorash, they can't escape the red thirst. They can't quench that desire, and it has similar effects on their individual behavior. Now, it is possible that other vampires did end up beating the thirst, but it would be such a tiny percentage as to be statistically insignificant. It's kind of the carrot at the end of the stick that so many strive for, but few could ever hope to attain. And yet still others thrive with that hunger. They live battle to battle, existing solely for the thrill of the hunt, with no endgame in mind. So in the year 1887 of the Imperial calendar, Wallach Harkin arrives at a place called Blood Keep, which is home to a group of Empire Knights called, you guessed it, the Order of the Blood Dragons. It's a fortress that anchors the Grey Mountain passes running from Paravon to the Empire, and Wallach walks into the place like he owns it and challenges every single man present to a duel. The weak ones are killed, and the strongest given the Blood Kiss to serve as his immortal champions. So suddenly, Wallach Harkin has an army, and he sets about molding this new order into a twisted parody of the honor and the discipline that characterized the disciples of Abhorash some 2,000 years prior. And while these newly transformed knights maintain some of the qualities that once made them human, it doesn't take very long before they have a very different understanding of the importance of mortals, which is to say, there is none. And many of them start treating living people like cattle, only meant for the slaughter. Where Abhorash would have ignored those not worthy of his blade, these newly christened Blood Knights slay all before them, and their devotion to perfection and martial skill ends up costing the lives of thousands in the immediate area. Which, as you might imagine, doesn't go over very well with the men of the Empire, who now have a pretty terrifying undead army harassing their cities. They band together under the orders of Gunther von Hall, a witch hunter descendant from the infamous necromancer Frederick von Hall, who's actually the same guy we know for a spell Von Hall's Danse Macabre, and they lay siege to Blood Keep. And the bloody standoff lasts 3 years. Many of the Blood Knights and Empire state troops are slain, and finally, Harkin is forced to abandon the keep and escape into the night. And around the same time, the Red Duke of Aquitaine, known simply to the Arabians as the Sword, awoke from his 500-year-long slumber and waged war in Bretonnia. To rewind it just a little bit, he was actually a Bretonnian noble, betrayed by his brethren during Crusade, and as he lay dying, none other than Abhorash himself came over and offered him the blood kiss. This was actually not the smartest thing Abhorash ever did, because the poisons in the Red Duke's blood mutated alongside the vampiric corruption and made something of a monster when he rose from death 3 days later. He didn't have much of anything going on inside that head except death and vengeance, and that meant that all of Bretonnia was his prey, because he was really pissed, and a lot of innocents died along his path to retribution. He was eventually put down and entombed for 500 years, until a bunch of dumbasses thought it'd be a good idea to let him out again, and this time, there was absolutely no remaining sanity whatsoever, as 5 centuries without blood is essentially how Vargheists are made, minus the Warpstone corruption. So he's a beast at this point. He's not really a human anymore. He gathers a bunch of vampiric knights to his side and waged an eerily similar war to the one the Knights of Blood Keep waged some 40 years earlier. And in fact, some of the remnants of those blood dragons almost certainly came into the Red Duke's employ in the wake of the fall of Blood Keep. But also around this time, Vlad von Karstein waltzed into Sylvania and began his slow corruption of the aristocratic families there. And it was to the Drakenhof Templars that he turned to be the righteous fist, with which he would cement his power on the battlefield. Now, one of the main issues facing these orders of vampire knights who are now sprouting up alongside the von Karstein bloodline in Castle Drakenhof, the Red Duke in Aquitaine, and at Blood Keep, was the dilution of their power. Every single warrior given the Blood Kiss could trace their lineage back to a progenitor vampire, one of the original great ones cursed, or blessed depending on how you want to look at it, by Neferata and Nagash's sorceries all those years ago. But as these orders grew in strength, and more men were turned, and as their presence became known and wars were waged to defeat them, it became very clear that these vampire commanders needed to make choices regarding their Blood Knights. Some, like Wallach Harkin, began their order with the intention of creating a very small, exceptionally elite group of warriors. This would typically have the benefit of flying more easily under the radar, but Wallach Harkin was never one to operate from the shadows, and so he quickly drew a lot of heat from his surrounding neighbors as he struck out and killed everything in sight. Vlad, on the other hand, was a lot more cunning, building up slowly over time and not unleashing his Blood Knights on the open field for almost 200 years after his reign began. But naturally, there were different schools of thought. You could keep these orders truly exclusive, only gifting the Blood Kiss to those warriors of immense stature and martial skill, but making it extremely hard to replenish losses should a battle go poorly, or you could be a bit more generous with your selection, allowing more vampires into the fold and creating a bigger heavy cavalry contingent for your army. This would come at the expense of being much more difficult to conceal and dilute the elite nature of your knights. Let's make no mistake here, a Blood Knight is still a Blood Knight, far surpassing most mortals in terms of skill at arms, strength, stamina, and speed, but the more vampires were brought under the wing of an order, particularly if they were sired by someone other than Abhorash or his immediate kin, that meant they would be quite a bit inferior to the original Blood Dragons after the fall of Lahmia. The further out one goes from the progenitor vampires, the weaker the bloodline becomes, so although there were knightly orders springing up all over the old world, some of them looked to maintain that purity and exclusiveness, while others managed to put more bodies on the field. The Drakenhof Templars were a good example of this. They were a truly elite cadre of shock troops who operated with complete autonomy in Vlad's and later Manfred's armies, the only beings not slave to their wills, but their hesitation at sullying the purity of their order, and the fact that they were consistently given the most dangerous missions because of their skill, meant that they were really difficult to replace. So when they got wrecked in battle, it could take centuries to recover those losses. Now, all these different orders, from the Knights of the Red Death to the Knights of the Black Grail, the Blood Dragons, and the Drakenhof Templars, all of them are inextricably linked to the knightly orders of the Empire and Bretonnia, dark parodies that absorbed many of the rituals and customs through osmosis and twisted them kind of into something more malignant. With the irony, of course, being that the knightly orders of Bretonnia are in many ways just as dark and oppressive as those of the Blood Knights. Sure, they might not actually drink the blood of their thralls, they just force them to starve and toil the entirety of their miserable existence while they live lives of luxury and decadence. So there's probably more in common between the two than the Bretonnians would ever care to admit. But when it comes to battlefield prowess, who would actually win in a straight-up fight? Well, we get plenty of looks at Blood Knight combat in the novels and the army books, and generally speaking, because of their tabletop stats and role, we typically put them at the same tier as Chaos Knights, Grail Knights, and Dragon Princes of Caledor. They aren't all exactly on the same level, but again, that's entirely dependent on the regiment as well. Where Blood Dragons are the elite of the elite, there are other squadrons of Blood Knights who wouldn't quite stack up quite the same way. Without question, they can be counted amongst the most elite cavalry on the planet. They clashed with the Silver Helms of Tor Alir and won convincingly during the ritual to awaken Nagash. They slaughtered hundreds of Reichsguard on more than one occasion, and at the Battle of Heffingen, during the end times, they were the shock force that broke the Empire's back, and almost resulted in the deaths of Kurt Helborg, Luther Huss, Schwarzhelm, and Karl Franz himself. It was their pride and utter hatred of Nagash's ideals, a sterile world with no combat, no glory, or honor, only death, that saw them turn to Khorne when they were trapped north of the Auric Bastion. And so while Vlad and the Drakenhof Templars fought with the Empire against the tides of chaos, Wallach Harkin led the charge for Khorne, astride a zombie dragon, and mortally wounded Karl Franz and Deathclaw, but not before his eye was ripped out by the Reikland Runefang. Many battles were fought between the Knights of the Realm and Knights of Moustillon in Bretonnia. While they're undoubtedly superior to the average Bretonnian knight, with Grail Knights it gets a hell of a lot harder. The Vampire Knights army book states that even the fabled Grail Knights of Bretonnia cannot match the Blood Knights lance for lance upon the field, but despite this rumor, such beings are anathema to vampires, and simply being near them can induce great pain and weakness in a vampire. The entire lore of Grail Knights basically demonstrates their power and skill at banishing the undead, and so again, while it depends on which knights are actually fighting, I'd say on average, a Grail Knight would probably have an advantage in melee. Now, interestingly enough, both their story arcs actually conclude fighting alongside each other with their greatest champions, the Green Knight and Abhorash, who long ago forged a friendship at La Masantel Abbey, make an appearance at the very end of all things, defending Bretonnia, with the remaining Blood and Grail Knights as Skaven and demons swarm the surface world. It's a shame we never actually get to see exactly what devastation they wreak amongst the end times hordes, but you can imagine two of the greatest warriors ever, alongside their incredibly powerful bodyguards, could do some seriously epic damage. In terms of physical characteristics, a Blood Knight from afar wouldn't look much different than a mortal man, but upon closer inspection, the signature pallid skin and the dark predatory eyes would become apparent. Some vampires, especially those of the Lahmian bloodline, alter their appearance to make themselves appear more comely or desirable than they already are, but Blood Knights who focus solely on the martial disciplines do their best to stand out, so crimson red and jet black ornate armor adorned with the motifs or literal body parts of the monsters they've slain are really common. More than anything, it's their signature armor that marks them on the battlefield, and there are very few places worse than standing on the receiving end of their charge. Throughout history, the thing that has defined Blood Knights best is their longevity, and this is probably the biggest factor in explaining why they are such a potent shock force. You take a mortal man who has already distanced himself from his peers in terms of combat ability, then you make them functionally immortal, you instill an even stricter martial code, and you explain to them that the only way to retain their superhuman speed and power while getting rid of their thirst is by killing a dragon in solo combat. And then they train, and they fight, and they train, and they fight for centuries, upwards of millennia, against every terror the world has to offer. And you can maybe begin to understand why they're considered such ungodly warriors. Not even the elves, not even the Grail Knights, have the time to train for 1500 or 2000 years. Very few Azur and even fewer Dark Elves live that long. To be fair, very few Blood Knights live that long either, but Luther Harkin in Lustria, Wallach Harkin of Bloodkeep, the Red Duke, and Abhorash are but a few examples who do, and that longevity and discipline forges them into some of the greatest warriors a world already teeming with them has ever seen. So yeah, the Blood Knights definitely have one of the more interesting backstories in Warhammer Fantasy, and as their origin lies in the founding of the very first vampires, I thought it'd be cool to take a look at how they evolved over time and what impact they had on the world. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to see more of this style, please let me know in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching. Indie Pride, signing out for now.